Edward Mordrake. The name alone sends shivers down the spine of anyone brave enough to utter it after dark. He is a figure shrouded in legend, yet disturbingly real. A man cursed at birth and whispered about for generations. Historians call him a medical anomaly, but those who have dug deeper into his story know the truth is far more unsettling. This is not just the tale of a man born with two faces. It is the story of horror that transcends the boundaries of human comprehension, rooted in despair, fear, and something that can only be described as otherworldly. The year was 1806, and the Mordrake family estate stood as a testament to their wealth and influence. A sprawling Gothic mansion in the English countryside, its spires pierced the sky, as though trying to escape the weight of its own history. The family was known for their eccentricities, whispered about in village taverns for their supposed dealings with the occult. Still, none of that prepared the household for the birth of Edward Mordrake. When the midwife emerged from the room, her face was ashen, her hands trembling. He has another face," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The child's cries echoed through the halls, sharp and unnerving. But it wasn't the sound of his cries that haunted the staff. It was the distinct sensation that the second face, lifeless and grotesque, was observing them. From his first breath, Edward was an enigma. His main face was strikingly handsome, a visage befitting his noble lineage. But the face on the back of his head was horrifying. Its features were twisted, its eyes half open as if caught in a state between life and death. Servants swore they saw its lips twitch, though the doctors dismissed these claims as nerves or imagination. For the first 5 years of Edward's life, his parents kept him hidden from the world. His mother, Lady Mordrake, insisted on praying over him every night, reciting passages from forbidden texts. She told no one where she had acquired them. His father, Lord Mordrake, avoided him entirely, retreating into his study with a decanter of brandy and a revolver always within arm's reach. But it wasn't Edward's deformity that drove fear into the hearts of those around him. It was the whispers. They began as faint murmurs, barely perceptible even in the dead of night. Servants passing by Edward's nursery reported hearing words they couldn't understand, as if spoken in an ancient tongue. Soon, the whispers became clearer, unmistakably emanating from the second face. "It's speaking," a maid claimed, pale and shaken, as she resigned her post. "And what it says? No child should know such things." By the time Edward turned 12, the whispers had evolved into something more. The face spoke not only to him but to others who dared venture too close. It taunted them, revealing secrets no one else could have known. One day, a groundskeeper fell to his knees, clutching his chest in terror after hearing the voice say, "I know what you buried in the woods." When the family finally sought help, it was not from doctors but from a group of scholars versed in esoteric knowledge. These were men who had spent their lives studying the arcane and the forbidden. They examined Edward under candlelight, murmuring among themselves, their expressions grim. After hours of deliberation, they concluded that Edward's condition was unlike anything they had ever encountered. "This is not a mere deformity," one of them said gravely. "The second face is aware." As Edward grew older, the whispers became more insistent. He tried to silence them by isolating himself in the estate's vast library, poring over books on philosophy, science, and the occult. But the face was always with him, its voice relentless, driving him to the brink of madness. One fateful night, Edward locked himself in his room and confronted the face in the mirror. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The face smiled, a slow, deliberate grin that sent shivers down his spine. And then it spoke, its voice cold and deliberate. "Everything." The servants who found Edward's room the next morning were never the same. He had written something on the walls, but when they tried to read it, they felt nauseous, as if the very words carried a curse. Edward himself sat in the center of the room, staring into nothingness, his once brilliant eyes now dull. It was then that his parents made the difficult decision to send him away, hoping that a new environment might bring him peace. But what they didn't know was that they were sending Edward, and the face, to a place where his story would take an even darker turn. They say curses are born not in moments of weakness, but in the shadows of powerful, unspoken truths. To understand Edward Mordrake's terrifying existence, we must go back further than his birth, back to the roots of the Mordrake lineage. The Mordrakes had long been a family of prominence, their wealth derived from industries as vast as shipping, textiles, and mining. But behind their riches lay a history that few dared to speak of. The family's rise to power had been swift and peculiar, their fortune growing exponentially in the span of just one generation. Many whispered that the Mordrakes had made a pact with something beyond human comprehension. It was Edward's great-grandfather, Algernon Mordrake, who had first been suspected of dealing in the occult. A man of ruthless ambition, Algernon was said to have sought knowledge and power from forbidden sources. Records of his expeditions reveal strange and unexplained gaps, entire years where he vanished from the public eye, only to return with treasures and relics that defied description. One of these relics was said to be an ancient tome, bound in a material no one could identify, its pages filled with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when stared at too long. The villagers surrounding the Mordrake estate spoke in hushed tones of rituals conducted on moonless nights, of strange lights flickering in the manor's tower, and of screams that carried on the wind. But none dared to confront Algernon directly, for fear of invoking his wrath. When Algernon died under mysterious circumstances, his body found in the tower room, his face frozen in an expression of sheer terror, the estate passed to his son, Thaddeus Mordrake. Thaddeus was a quieter man, preferring to live in seclusion. But the curse that had latched onto the Mordrake bloodline did not rest. Strange events continued to plague the estate. Servants would disappear without a trace, crops would wither overnight, and livestock would be found mutilated in ways no animal could have accomplished. By the time Edward's father, Elias Mordrake, inherited the estate, the family's reputation had grown so dark that even their wealth could not shield them from the whispers. Elias attempted to distance himself from his ancestors' legacy, but the shadow of the Mordrake name loomed large. He married Lady Evelina, a kind and devout woman who hoped to cleanse the family of its past. When she became pregnant with Edward, she saw it as a chance for redemption, a child born into a new era, free from the sins of his forebears. But the curse would not be denied. Evelina's pregnancy was fraught with complications. She was plagued by vivid nightmares of a face staring at her from the darkness, its lips moving silently. Objects in the house began to move on their own, and the staff reported hearing whispers in the dead of night. The night of Edward's birth was one of the darkest in the Mordrake family history. A storm raged outside, the wind howling like a chorus of anguished souls. Evelina screamed for hours, her cries echoing through the halls. When Edward finally entered the world, the midwife's gasp was followed by a deathly silence. The child was alive, but his second face seemed to mock them all with its grotesque smirk. Evelina fainted at the sight, and Elias stormed out of the room, his face pale and his hands trembling. As the weeks turned into months, it became clear that Edward was no ordinary child. His second face, though incapable of speech at first, seemed to follow people with its eyes. Servants reported feeling as though it could see directly into their souls, exposing their darkest secrets. Evelina prayed endlessly, her desperation growing with each passing day. She sought out priests, doctors, and mystics, but none could explain or remedy Edward's condition. It wasn't until a traveling scholar arrived at the estate that the family began to piece together the true nature of their curse. The scholar, a man named Dr. Alaric Vespertine, was an expert in esoteric phenomena. He examined Edward closely, his expression growing grimmer with every passing moment. Finally, he turned to Elias and Evelina, his voice heavy with dread. This child, he is not merely afflicted by a deformity. His second face is a conduit, a vessel for forces we cannot comprehend. I have seen this before, though never so pronounced. You must understand, the face is not a part of him. It is something else entirely. Elias demanded to know what he meant, but Vespertine refused to elaborate. He left the estate the next morning, his carriage disappearing into the mist. Days later, the Mordrakes received word that Vespertine had been found dead in a nearby village, his body mutilated beyond recognition. The journal he had left behind contained a single chilling entry about Edward. The face speaks. From that moment on, Evelina and Elias were consumed by fear. Evelina became withdrawn, spending her days in the chapel, while Elias began drinking heavily, his once steady hands now shaking with every movement. Edward, oblivious to the weight of the curse he carried, grew up in isolation, his only company the whispers of the face that seemed to know him better than he knew himself. But the true horror was yet to come. By the time Edward reached the age of 16, the Mordrake estate had become a prison both for him and for anyone who dared to enter its gates. The whispers from his second face were no longer a private torment. They had become a force that touched everyone in the household. Servants quit in droves, unable to bear the feeling of unseen eyes following them or the whispers that echoed even when no one was nearby. Those who stayed were either too loyal or too terrified to leave, but even they avoided Edward at all costs. Edward himself had changed. Once a curious, intelligent boy who sought solace in books and art, he had grown cold and withdrawn. He rarely spoke, except to his mother, and even then, their conversations were brief and strained. Evelina clung to the hope that her prayers might save him, but deep down, she knew the Edward she loved was slipping away. It was the face. The whispers were no longer just words. They were commands. Edward would disappear for hours at a time, wandering the estate's labyrinthine halls, his footsteps echoing like a death knell. When he returned, his eyes were distant, his expression unreadable. The face, however, seemed to radiate a sinister satisfaction, its lips curling into a grotesque smile. One night, a scream shattered the silence of the manor. Evelina and Elias rushed to the source, their hearts pounding. In the east wing, they found one of the maids collapsed on the floor, her eyes wide with terror. She pointed a trembling finger at Edward, who stood at the end of the hallway, his shadow stretching unnaturally long against the flickering candlelight. "It spoke to me," the maid whispered, her voice barely audible. It told me things no one should know." Elias grabbed Edward by the arm, dragging him back to his room. "What did you do to her?" he demanded, his voice trembling with rage. Edward didn't answer. He simply stared at his father, his expression unreadable. But the face on the back of his head, it smirked. That night, Elias locked himself in his study with a bottle of brandy and a loaded pistol. Evelina stayed by Edward's bedside, praying fervently as he slept. Or at least, she thought he was sleeping. In the dim light of the room, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The second face wasn't asleep. Its eyes were open, and they were staring directly at her. From that night on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They no longer confined themselves to Edward's presence. They echoed throughout the manor, seeping into every crevice and corner. Servants reported hearing their names called in the dead of night, only to find no one there. Mirrors reflected images that didn't belong. And always, there was the face, its grotesque features seeming to grow more expressive, more alive. Edward's journal, once filled with sketches and philosophical musings, took a darker turn. The entries became cryptic, filled with symbols and fragmented sentences that seemed to form a pattern no one could decipher. But it was the drawings that were most disturbing, dark, chaotic images of twisted figures, shadowy landscapes, and a single recurring motif. The face, staring out from the pages with an expression that seemed to mock the viewer. One particular entry stood out. Written in shaky handwriting, it read, "The face has a name. It whispered it to me last night. I dare not speak it aloud." The following days were marked by a series of increasingly bizarre events. Doors slammed shut on their own, and footsteps echoed in empty hallways. The family chapel, once a place of solace for Evelina, became a source of dread. The candles refused to stay lit, and the crucifix on the altar was found turned upside down. Evelina tried to ignore these signs, but the weight of the growing darkness was too much to bear. Elias, desperate for answers, sought out another expert. This time, a priest known for performing exorcisms. Father Gregory arrived at the estate armed with holy water, a crucifix, and an unwavering faith. He entered Edward's room alone, determined to confront whatever was plaguing the boy. The confrontation did not last long. Father Gregory emerged less than an hour later, his face pale and his hands trembling. He refused to speak of what he had seen, but before leaving the estate, he turned to Elias and said, "Your son is beyond salvation. Whatever this is, it is not of this world." That night, Edward disappeared. His room was left in disarray, the walls scrawled with symbols in what appeared to be his own blood. His journal was open on the desk, its final entry a single chilling sentence. "The face told me where to go." The family searched the estate for hours, but there was no sign of him. Then, just before dawn, Evelina heard a faint sound coming from the tower room, the same room where Algernon Mordrake had met his end. When she and Elias reached the room, they found Edward standing at the window, his back to them. The face on the back of his head was smiling. Without a word, Edward turned and climbed onto the windowsill. Evelina screamed, but it was too late. Edward jumped, his body vanishing into the mist below. But the horror did not end there. In the days that followed, the whispers continued. They seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere, filling the air with a sense of dread. The face had left Edward, but it had not left the estate. And for those who stayed behind, it became clear that Edward's descent into darkness was only the beginning. Edward's disappearance marked a turning point for the Mordrake family, but for the world beyond the estate, his story was far from over. Days after he vanished, rumors began to surface of a strange figure wandering the moors, his presence accompanied by an unnatural chill that seeped into the bones of anyone who crossed his path. Witnesses claimed to hear whispers, faint but insistent, urging them to follow the figure into the fog. None who ventured too close returned the same. Weeks passed before Edward was finally found, or rather, apprehended. A group of villagers had discovered him sitting by an old, crumbling well in the woods. He was unkempt, his once elegant clothing torn and filthy, but what truly unnerved them was the look in his eyes, empty, detached, as if he were no longer entirely present. The second face, however, was wide-eyed and alert, its lips twisted into a grotesque grin that seemed to mock the living. The villagers restrained Edward and delivered him to the authorities. He was transported to Blackthorn Asylum, a grim institution nestled deep in the countryside, where society sent those deemed too dangerous or too disturbing to exist among the general population. At Blackthorn, Edward's arrival was met with both curiosity and unease. The asylum's head physician, Dr. Samuel Hargrove, was a man of science who prided himself on rational explanations for even the most bizarre conditions. He was determined to study Edward, to uncover the truth behind his deformity. But as the days turned to weeks, Dr. Hargrove's skepticism began to waver. Edward rarely spoke, but when he did, his words were cryptic, often seeming to reference events or knowledge no one could explain. "The storm is coming," he said one evening, his voice flat and emotionless. The next morning, the asylum's east wing was struck by lightning, setting it ablaze. The second face, however, was not so silent. Patients in the neighboring cells reported hearing it whispering in the dead of night. Its voice was low and guttural, speaking in a language no one could identify. Some claimed it was trying to communicate, while others believed it was laughing, a sound so unnatural it chilled the soul. One night, Dr. Hargrove decided to confront Edward directly. Armed with a notebook and a growing sense of unease, he entered the cell alone. Edward was sitting on the edge of the cot, his back to the doctor. The room was dimly lit, the shadows dancing across the walls as the candle flickered in the draught. "Edward," Dr. Hargrove began cautiously, "I need you to tell me about the face. What is it? What does it want?" Edward didn't respond, but the second face did. Its lips moved, forming words that Dr. Hargrove would later describe as a mockery of human speech. Though the doctor could not understand the words, he felt their meaning deep in his bones, a sense of dread that defied logic. That night, Dr. Hargrove began documenting the phenomenon in a private journal. His entries grew more frantic with each passing day, describing unexplainable occurrences throughout the asylum. Patients in the same wing as Edward reported vivid nightmares, their minds filled with images of shadowy figures and endless corridors that seemed to lead nowhere. Staff members began to quit, unable to endure the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to permeate the air around Edward's cell. But the most disturbing account came from one of the guards assigned to patrol the wing at night. He claimed to have heard Edward speaking to the second face, though the words were muffled and indistinct. When he peered through the cell window, he saw something that made him drop his lantern and run screaming from the building. "It was looking at me," he later told the asylum's director, his voice trembling. "Not Edward, the face. It was staring at me like it knew everything about me. And it was smiling." The whispers began to spread beyond Edward's cell. Patients in other wings of the asylum reported hearing their names called in the night, accompanied by the faint sound of laughter. The asylum's chapel, once a place of solace for the staff, became a source of fear. The crucifix on the altar was found twisted, its metal warped into an unrecognizable shape. Dr. Hargrove's journal took a darker turn, his once methodical observations giving way to ramblings about unseen forces and an intelligence that defied comprehension. In one of his final entries, he wrote, "The face is not human. It is ancient, malevolent, and aware. I fear it is not confined to Edward alone." The culmination of these events came on a stormy night when the asylum was plunged into chaos. The power went out, plunging the building into darkness. Screams echoed through the halls as patients and staff alike were overcome by a sense of suffocating dread. When the lights finally flickered back on, Edward's cell was empty. The only clue to his whereabouts was a single word scrawled on the wall in what appeared to be blood. Freedom. Edward was gone, but his presence lingered. The asylum never recovered from that night. Whispers continued to echo through its empty halls, and the staff who remained refused to enter the wing where Edward had been held. Blackthorn Asylum was eventually abandoned, left to crumble into ruin. But even now, those who dare to venture near its decaying walls claim to hear faint whispers carried on the wind. A voice that chills the soul and leaves no doubt that Edward Mordrake's story is far from over. Edward Mordrake had vanished from Blackthorn Asylum, leaving behind only fear and unanswered questions. But his disappearance was not the end of his story. If anything, it marked the beginning of something far more disturbing, an escalation of events that would blur the lines between reality and the unexplainable. Rumors of Edward's presence began to surface across the countryside. Farmers claimed to see a lone figure walking through their fields at dusk, his silhouette unmistakably disfigured. Travelers spoke of a man with a second face lurking at crossroads, his voice calling out to them in a language they couldn't understand. These encounters were always brief, but they left a lasting impression on those who experienced them. The whispers, however, did not stay confined to the places where Edward was seen. They began to spread, carried on the wind like an infection. People who had never heard of Edward Mordrake found themselves waking in the dead of night to a faint voice speaking directly into their ears. It told them secrets, things they had never shared with anyone. It asked them questions they couldn't answer, questions that filled them with a growing sense of dread. Amid this growing chaos, a group of paranormal investigators took an interest in Edward's case. Led by Professor Nathaniel Hargrave, a historian and self-proclaimed expert in the occult, the group set out to uncover the truth behind the whispers. Hargrave was fascinated by the historical accounts of Edward's second face and believed it to be connected to ancient folklore about parasitic spirits, entities that attach themselves to the living, feeding on their fears and desires. The team began their investigation at Blackthorn Asylum, now an abandoned shell of its former self. They arrived at dusk, their equipment packed into heavy cases and their nerves steeled against the ominous atmosphere. The building loomed before them, its windows shattered, its walls covered in creeping ivy. The air was heavy with the smell of decay, and the faint sound of wind moving through the empty corridors created an eerie backdrop to their work. As they set up their equipment, Hargrave explained his theory. Edward Mordrake's condition was not a medical anomaly. The second face was an external manifestation of something far older, far darker. A parasite, if you will, that used Edward as a vessel. And when Edward disappeared, it didn't leave. It simply found a new way to exist. The team began their investigation in the East Wing, where Edward had been held. They used a variety of tools, infrared cameras, audio recorders, and electromagnetic field detectors. But the results were unlike anything they had encountered before. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and their equipment began to malfunction. The audio recorder picked up faint whispers, though no one in the room was speaking. "It's him," one of the investigators whispered, his voice trembling. "Is still here." As night fell, the group gathered in the chapel, where the energy felt most oppressive. Hargrave produced a series of historical documents, including the journal of Dr. Samuel Hargrove. He read aloud the final entries, which described the whispers and the sense of an unseen presence that defied explanation. As Hargrave spoke, the room grew colder, and the candles they had lit began to flicker violently. It was then that they heard it, a voice, low and guttural, speaking from the shadows. The words were indistinct, but they carried a weight that pressed down on the group, filling them with an overwhelming sense of fear. One of the investigators dropped his flashlight, the beam dancing wildly across the walls as he backed away. "We shouldn't be here," he said, his voice shaking. "We need to leave." But Hargrave was determined to continue. He believed they were on the verge of uncovering something extraordinary, something that would redefine their understanding of the supernatural. He began asking questions aloud, hoping to provoke a response. "Edward," he said, his voice steady despite the growing tension. "If you're here, if the face is still with you, show us a sign." The response was immediate. The candles extinguished themselves, plunging the room into darkness. A deafening silence followed, broken only by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud. They seemed to come from all directions at once, circling the group. When the lights of their flashlights finally steadied, they saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the chapel. It was Edward, or what was left of him. His body was emaciated, his skin pale and almost translucent. His main face was expressionless, but the second face was alive with emotion, its lips curling into a grin that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. The investigators froze, their fear rendering them unable to move. The second face began to speak, its voice layered with tones that didn't belong to any human throat. The words were incomprehensible, but the intent was clear. This was not a plea for help or a cry of pain. It was a warning, or perhaps a threat. Before anyone could react, the figure vanished, leaving the room colder and darker than before. The group fled the asylum, abandoning their equipment in their haste to escape. Hargrave, once so confident in his theories, was left shaken and silent. In the days that followed, the team tried to make sense of what they had experienced. But their attempts to analyze the audio and video recordings were fruitless. The files were corrupted, filled with static and bursts of distorted sound. The only clear moment was a single frame captured on one of the cameras. Edward standing in the chapel, his second face staring directly at the lens. Hargrave eventually published his findings, though he omitted many of the more disturbing details. He knew that the world wasn't ready to hear the full story of Edward Mordrake. But he also knew that the whispers would continue, spreading like a disease, infecting the minds of those who dared to listen. And somewhere, in the shadows of the world, Edward waits. Or perhaps, the face waits, biding its time until it finds another vessel. The remnants of Edward Mordrake's life, scattered across history, had become the stuff of legend, tales passed down in hushed whispers, distorted by fear and time. But there was one artifact that offered a direct glimpse into the mind of the man himself, his journal. Long thought lost after Edward's disappearance, the journal resurfaced decades later in the hands of an unsuspecting collector. The tattered leather-bound book was found among the ruins of the Mordrake estate, buried beneath rubble and ash. Its pages were brittle, stained with age and something darker, yet its contents were disturbingly intact. The journal contained fragments of Edward's life, written in a style that shifted between lucid reflection and chaotic rambling. At first glance, it seemed like the work of a man consumed by madness. But as scholars began to study its pages, a pattern emerged, one that hinted at a horrifying truth about the second face. The early entries were unremarkable, detailing Edward's days as a child confined to the estate. He wrote of his isolation, his longing for freedom, and his attempts to understand the whispers that plagued him. "I feel as though I am two people," he wrote in one entry. "One who seeks the light and another who dwells in darkness." But as the entries progressed, they took a darker turn. Edward began describing vivid dreams of shadowy figures and labyrinthine corridors. He wrote of waking to find his second face staring at him in the mirror, its expression alive with malice. One entry, dated shortly before his escape from the Mordrake estate, stood out. "It knows things I have never seen or heard, but they are true. It whispers of places that should not exist, of names that carry a weight I cannot bear, and it watches me, even when I close my eyes." The journal also contained drawings, crude yet haunting. Among the sketches were depictions of the second face in various forms, grinning, scowling, and, most disturbingly, speaking. One image showed the face with its mouth wide open, a torrent of black shapes spilling forth like a river of shadows. Beneath it, Edward had written a single word: hungry. As the scholars delved deeper, they discovered a series of encoded passages that required weeks of effort to decipher. The decoded text revealed something far more chilling than anyone could have anticipated. Edward had not been merely documenting his torment. He had been chronicling his descent into something unthinkable. One passage described an encounter Edward had while wandering the estate late at night. "I saw it tonight, not in the mirror, but in the flesh. The face left me, if only for a moment, and I followed it. It moved like smoke, sliding between the shadows. It led me to the tower room, where I felt its full presence for the first time. It is not me, though it is bound to me, and it waits for something, or someone." This revelation sparked new theories among those studying the journal. What if the face was not merely a part of Edward but an entity in its own right? What if it had attached itself to him as a host, using his body as a vessel for its own purposes? The final entries in the journal were the most disturbing. Written in a shaky hand, they described a growing loss of control. "It speaks more now, not just to me, but through me. My voice is not my own. My thoughts are not my own. It feeds on my fear, my pain, and it grows stronger with each passing day." The very last page contained a chilling message scrawled in bold, uneven letters. "The face has a name. I heard it in the whispers. I dare not write it, for to do so would give it power. But it knows you are reading this, and it is coming for you." The scholars who studied the journal were never the same. Several abandoned their careers, claiming they could no longer bear the nightmares that followed them. One vanished without a trace, leaving behind only his notes, which contained frantic warnings about the face and its hunger. The journal itself was locked away in a private collection, where it remains to this day. But its contents have continued to spread, passed down through second-hand accounts and fragmented retellings. And for those who have dared to read its pages, the whispers are said to follow them, growing louder with each passing night. For the face that haunted Edward Mordrake was never truly bound to him. It was, and always has been, waiting for its next vessel. And those who delve too deeply into its story may find themselves closer to it than they ever intended. Edward Mordrake may have vanished, but his story did not. Over the years, accounts of strange occurrences linked to his name have surfaced from places far and wide, each one adding another layer to the unsettling mystery of his existence. What began as a legend confined to the Mordrake estate and Blackthorn Asylum has grown into a worldwide phenomenon, an enduring horror that refuses to be forgotten. The first recorded sighting of Edward, or rather, the presence associated with him, occurred 5 years after his disappearance. A family traveling through the countryside reported encountering a lone figure standing at a crossroads. They described him as tall and gaunt, with a hood covering his head. As their carriage approached, the figure turned, revealing a second face, its twisted features illuminated by the moonlight. The family fled, but the encounter did not end there. Over the following weeks, the children began to hear whispers in their rooms at night. The voice called their names, revealing secrets no one else could know. The eldest son, overcome by fear, took his own life, leaving behind a note that read, "It watches me. It knows me. It will not stop." Similar incidents began cropping up in isolated villages and towns, each bearing the same eerie hallmarks. A figure with 2 faces, a wave of inexplicable whispers, and a lingering dread that seemed to infect everyone it touched. Paranormal investigators who delved into these reports found themselves ensnared in a web of fear. One investigator, who spent months studying the Mordrake legend, described waking up to find his own reflection smiling at him, a smile that was not his own. But it wasn't just individuals who were affected. Whole locations seemed to bear the mark of Edward Mordrake. Blackthorn Asylum, long abandoned, became a hotspot for thrill-seekers and ghost hunters. Many who entered the crumbling building reported hearing whispers and footsteps, despite being alone. Others claimed to see a figure in the shadows, always just out of reach. One such visitor, a filmmaker documenting the asylum's haunted reputation, captured something chilling on camera. While panning across the decrepit chapel, his lens caught a brief but unmistakable image of a man with 2 faces standing at the altar. The footage went viral, reigniting public interest in the Mordrake legend. But the resurgence of Edward's story came with consequences. Those who watched the footage reported strange phenomena, unexplained sounds, distorted reflections, and, most disturbingly, whispers that grew louder the more they tried to ignore them. Some claimed that the second face began appearing in their dreams, its eyes piercing and its mouth moving silently, as if it were trying to speak directly into their minds. Among the most chilling modern accounts was the case of a researcher named Dr. Evelyn March, who dedicated her life to unraveling the mystery of Edward Mordrake. Dr. March was a skeptic by nature, dismissing the supernatural elements of the story as folklore exaggerated over time. But as she delved deeper into Edward's history, she began experiencing phenomena she could not explain. Her colleagues noted her increasing paranoia, her insistence that she was being followed. One night, she left a frantic voicemail for a friend, saying, "The whispers, they are real. It's not just a story. The face, it's watching me." Dr. March disappeared the next day. Her apartment was left in disarray, her research scattered across the floor. Among her notes was a single, haunting phrase written over and over. "It knows my name." In the years that followed, Edward's legend continued to grow, fueled by the rise of the internet and the proliferation of horror forums and social media. People from around the world began sharing their own encounters, describing eerie similarities that could not be easily dismissed. A shadowy figure glimpsed in the corner of their vision. Whispers that seemed to follow them from room to room. Dreams of a second face, grinning and malevolent. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Edward Mordrake's legacy is the sense that his story is still unfolding. Researchers who have studied his journal and the accounts linked to him believe that the second face was not bound to Edward alone. It was, and remains, a wandering entity, an ancient force searching for its next vessel. For those brave, or foolish, enough to seek the truth, the warnings are clear. Do not speak his name after dark. Do not linger in front of mirrors for too long. And if you hear whispers in the night, whatever you do, do not answer them. Because Edward Mordrake may be gone, but the face is still out there, waiting. And if you feel its gaze, if you hear its voice, it may already have chosen you.